Okay, hi guys. So this is part 3. We're talking about the War of 1812. Again, I'm going to talk through these slides hopefully quickly. I don't want to ramble. So I have a takeaway slide here in case you're not really thinking about using the war and you just want to make sure that you have a general sense of what's going on. We will come back to this, of course, soon, but yeah, ultimately, historians call it the Second War of Independence a lot because really the big picture takeaway is that in terms of the U.S. British relationship, not much changes, right? The United States emerges on the other end as an intact, arguably even more, right, more sovereign of a nation, right, less economically dependent on Great Britain, as we're going to see in the future. So, yes, from an American perspective, this is seen as the Second War of Independence. Another thing we'll look at is that the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. was burned. So we're going to deal with the aftermath of that, in particular, the financial impact of that. And also, this war is really going to lead to the ultimate death of the Federalist Party. And the peace treaty we'll talk about briefly, and also we'll talk about how the war affects Andrew Jackson's role in U.S. history. So, moving forward here. Uh, One big takeaway, or I don't think I listed this as a term on Power School, but I'd be familiar with the term warhawks, which you see here. You see two warhawks down below. This is John C. Calhoun of South Carolina down here, and this is Henry Clay of Kentucky over here. And they were both strong supporters of going to war with Britain. So, warhawk, we still use this term, right? The idea is that it is a member of government, doesn't have to be any particular office, who wants to go to war. Kind of speaks for itself. But hawkish, right? The idea that you're acting very aggressive. So that's where that term comes from. Again, we talked about the Federalist Party opposition to the war. We'll talk about the Hartford Convention in a second and how that plays into it. And the other important takeaway is that in order to fight against the Americans, the British end up allying with many surrounding Indian nations. So, one of the other major aftermaths of the War of 1812 that really gets the slight historically is the impact that the war has on Native Americans. So, we'll also touch upon that. I mentioned the Capitol building burning. This is a pretty contemporary work of, one could say, propaganda, right? One could say art. One could use a number of words to describe this piece, but it was painted by actually a French artist who was under the patronage of Britain. So that tells you a heck of a lot right there. So knowing the background behind a piece, which is why I wanted to write the source here, sorry about that, is actually really, really significant, right? Because in a lot of ways, when I look at this thing, it looks like the Boston Massacre, but this was painted, even though the artist is French, you could say that this was painted from the British perspective. So, oh, the irony. All right, so the Hartford Convention. I mentioned this previously. So this cartoon's a little hard to read, but I can explain it, and you could probably zoom in if you wanted to read the text. But I'll explain the cartoon in a second. Let me explain what the convention was in case you're still confused about that. So this takes place in the capital of Connecticut, Hartford, and this is basically the remains of the Federalist Party. It is very, very small at this point. One of the leaders, Thomas Pinckney, was actually a huge supporter of seceding from the Union, right? We normally think of secession as a Southern thing, but in the case of the Hartford Convention, we actually had a brief attempt for New England to secede, right? But the ultimate takeaway is that by the time the Hartford Convention took place, the peace negotiations were already in process, and so the Federalists were not going to uh, be heard ultimately by the federal government. They were really just sort of shrugged off, and you'll see that they get very little attention in the peace treaty as well. So, if anything, the Hartford Convention signals an even greater decline for the Federalist Party. For the interest of time, instead of describing this cartoon, I'll just write about it in the description of this video.